This is a fascinating topic that we have been talking about political strategies and military acumen in the first few sessions of the morning, and we are now entering the economic scene. The topic says towards an equitable global economic order. Very interesting and relevant topic. And to discuss this topic, we have three eminent speakers, one from Delhi, another from London, and the third from Singapore. Each one is distinguished in his own right, some more distinguished than the others. And before I hand over to the first speaker, I just want to give a small background so that everybody is on board. In 1950, we had 60 nations, independent sovereign nations, 2.5 billion people in this world, and they had an economy of $4.08 trillion US dollars equivalent. And the per capita income was $3,300 globally. Now come to 2020, we have 195 countries. We have 7.8 billion people. And after allowing for correction because of COVID, we have a global GDP of close to $84 trillion. And the per capita income is about 17,000 US dollars equivalent. Now to repeat the numbers, it is 60 UN members versus 195 members, and 2.5 billion people versus 7.8 billion people, $4 trillion versus $84 trillion, and $3,300 versus 17,000 US dollars per capita income. What does it mean to the rest of the world? This has been an amazing growth. The population has tripled, the number of countries has tripled, but the wealth of the world has multiplied more than 20 times. It would have been 21 times now, and it would have been 22 times if had there been no COVID. Now, there are anomalies in the situation. The richest 1% of the world's population owns more than the remaining 99% of the population. And we have 700 million people who are living in abject poverty. And we have 5 countries of the world which have 62% of the global wealth. What I'm trying to give through the statistics is there is a degree of inequality. Despite the enormous growth the world has acquired and achieved during the last 70 years, its distribution has gone totally wonky. The question that needs to be discussed now is, what do we do to bring in some kind of balance and equity to this world, which is now divided so badly between the rich and the poor, between the north and the south, and between the haves and the have-nots. And that is where I end. And I now request Rahul Chhabra, who is an economist from the St. Stephen's College and a master's from Delhi School of Economics, and a business management graduate from Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, which is a reputed institution. And he has been an ambassador to many countries, including Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Nairobi, and he has been ambassador to the United Nations Environment Program also. And he's currently holding this position of Secretary Economic Relations between India and the rest of the world. So nobody better than him to discuss this topic from the government of India's side. And here I conclude my remarks and request Rahul to come on board. Thank you, Rahul. It's all yours.
Namaste. Thank you, Ambassador Ghanashyam, for that kind introductory words. So if I thought I'll just break up my presentation into 5 parts. I'll start with a little historical background, which you also did. Luckily, you called off the figure, so I won't have to do that. We'll get into the second part where we try to understand what this global inequality actually means in actual terms. We talk about the Human Development Report and UNCTAD and SDGs 10 and 17. We then come to the current crisis, which is sort of touched upon. We get on to India's position in this scenario, and then a few concluding remarks. So, of course, historically, post World War II, where we sort of set the stage. The IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT sort of emerged, and international trade and capital flows began. This was sort of supplemented in 74 when we really, UNGA, where there was a landmark resolution on a new international economic order. I think it was formally recognized that the need was there, it was felt, and there was even a GA resolution on that. It has been over 4 decades since we had that resolution. But somewhere midway through that, about 20, 25 years since that resolution, came the Asian financial crisis. There, that was a sort of maybe the beginnings of the sort of suspicion, extensive suspicion of the Washington consensus. Will that be able to deliver the goods? So there was this also accelerated sort of a rising awareness of regional cooperation and the need to work towards, again, this equitable global order that we are talking about. It went on then with 10 years later, the subprime mortgage crisis, the 2010 sovereign debt crisis in Europe, the earlier one in the United States. So the crisis kept sort of coming on, and the international economic system, it seemed to again become so incapable of really dealing with this detection, prevention, and treatment of these crises. So the wave of globalization, while that was strengthening, the sort of these crises were also happening. So we needed that more regional and cross-regional sort of economic governance platforms to continue to play a really much more important role was required. But then we saw that, the real reason sort of probably became the lack of a full and effective participation of developing countries, one would say, in this decision making and norm setting, or in the global financial regulatory system. So as a quick historical sort of synopsis, I thought I'll just summarize that. So now what exactly is this global inequality that we are talking about, that we are trying to move towards a more equitable system? The Human Development Report 2019, which is titled Beyond Income, Beyond Averages, Beyond Today, Inequalities in Human Development. I'll just run through some of the major findings and bullet points so that we understand what are we looking at. Many people, if were stepping aside, were able to move above these minimum floors of achievement in human development. Even though that was happening, widespread disparities still remained, and you referred to that also, Ambassador Ghanashyam. So then the second issue was that a new generation of really severe inequalities in human development were emerging. And while many of the unresolved inequalities of the 20th century were declining. The third was that inequalities in human development can accumulate through life, frequently heightened by deep power imbalances. The fourth issue that was brought out was that assessing inequalities in human development really demands a sort of revolution in metrics. And the sort of final point that I'd like to bring out was that redressing these inequalities, which we want to do in 21st century, is possible if we act now, before imbalances in economic power really translate into entrenched political dominance, and it becomes sort of difficult to sort of dismantle that. So these inequalities that we are talking about, and you gave the figures, so I don't want to go over that, are really a roadblock in achieving sort of the Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030. They're not just about disparities in income and wealth, as I mentioned, and they cannot be just accounted for by simply using summary measures of inequality, focusing just on one single dimension. And this will really shape the prospects of people that may really live to see actually the 22nd century. So we are talking of long-term implications of this. And again, I quote from the report itself that what the changing world requires is really to what will shape this inequality in the future. So existing and new forms of inequality will interact with major social, economic, and environmental forces. And we are seeing two of these seismic shifts. One is climate change, which we are seeing, and the second is technological transformation. As you know, climate change is affecting really the poorest the hardest, and the technological advances like machine learning and AI are again leaving entire groups of people behind. Even countries are being left behind. So, what is now the UNCTAD, the estimates that they have spoken about briefly? They are talking about inequality between developing and developed countries have increased steadily between 1970 and 2001. So that's a concerning feature. But then, sort of the silver lining in that cloud is that over the last 10 years, the global distribution of GDP per capita has become a little more equal. So that's nice, though, sort of, as I said, the silver lining has come out in that. But we are seeing that in the last few years, I think 4 or 5 years, the latest data for which is available, the relative difference in the rich and the poorest countries in the world has remained almost unchanged. So it seems to have now stabilized the situation. Uh, in that sense, we now look at what SDG 10 talks about. I mean, it really addresses this issue of global and national inequality. So we are talking of reducing inequalities and ensuring that no one is left behind. These are really integral to the SDG, and the 10 talks about this. Inequality within and among countries is a persistent cause of concern, and there are some positive signs. But the more deeper ramifications of this inequality is because there is evidence from developing countries that children are being more than disproportionately hit. The gender imbalance is being affected. The people who have disabilities are being badly hit. So it's really again that it's the sort of the marginalized section or the weaker sections that are obviously being very badly hit. For example, while 1 in 10 children is a child with a disability, only 28% of persons with significant disabilities have access to disability benefits globally. Then we go on to what SDG 17 has again talked about. It's really a key tool in addressing global inequalities. The thing where it talks about net ODA flows and Development Assistance Committee of the OECD is speaking about that being at about $147 billion in 2019. But many countries have not met, obviously, their SDG 17 commitments. Now I come to the current crisis, which of course we can't have a seminar without talking about that, COVID-19. You refer to it also. That has really completely transformed. If ever there was a black swan event, well, this is it. So we have now seen complete transformation in the way we live, work, interact with each other. Staying at home has become the new normal. So, but this has also again deepened the existing inequalities, as is evident from many of us who are sort of looking at it more closely and seeing how it's impacting societies. So, global unemployment having gone up, workers' incomes have been slashed if they have got jobs still left. It has also put at risk the limited progress that was made on gender equality and women's rights over the past few decades. So pretty much in terms of all across the board, I mean, this has had really hard negative effects. So the world economy really is at a critical juncture, and how we respond to it is really going to determine our future. So we need to, while we are seeing the sort of green shoots that are appearing in the global economy, downside risks are remaining. There is including the sluggish sort of global trade and investment figures, and the negative spillover of macroeconomic policies of the developed countries, further increasing the vulnerability of the entire world economy. The last point in this section that I want to talk about, the COVID thing, that the emerging markets and developing economies have been really the leading engines of global growth since the start of this century, at least. They've been facing increasingly complicated and challenging external environment. And the sort of insufficient voice and representation of developing countries in international economic governance have weakened their ability, and they are the drivers, which has been shown, has actually weakened their ability of the international community to effectively address these key global challenges. Just a small example is what's happening at the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, which is a key foundation of the WTO. And there's a complete deadlock in that situation. So, but we'll come to that when I talk about India's position. So I come to the fourth segment of my presentation. So India is in favor of, I will break it up into two parts, the IMF and the WTO in this section. So India is in favor of timely completion of the general review of quotas of the IMF. We believe that the accumulated misalignment in quota shares with respect to relative economic weight of members has significantly undermined the legitimacy and effectiveness of the fund. India believes that quota resources should rise for the IMF to play an effective role at the center of the global financial safety net. While it is a fact that permanent resources of the fund, that is, quotas, are supplemented by borrowed resources, new arrangements to borrow and borrowing agreements have served the fund well. India's position has been that quota size needs to increase, but at the same time, borrowed resources should decline so as to maintain the quota-based nature of the fund. So that is what we feel for the new going forward, how it should move. Coming to the trade front, I already spoke about the resolution of the dispute settlement mechanism deadlock at the WTO. Of course, we feel that the WTO is a very important forum for all of us, especially the developing countries like India. And we recognize that the effectiveness of the multilateral trading system depends on the implementation of WTO rules by all members, as well as their respective enforcement, because it needs to maintain the members' rights and obligations. India stands for a transparent, participative, and equitable multilateral trading system and believes there is no alternative to the WTO actually in the area of multilateral trade rulemaking. And we really believe that a rules-based system is in the interest of the entire world, especially for developing countries, as I've reiterated. And we must do everything to make it work. Reforms at the WTO must strengthen the fundamentals of the WTO, such as the consensus-based decision-making, non-discrimination, special and differential treatment, and focus on development. I'd like to now conclude with my concluding remarks. The global economic landscape has undergone profound changes over time. After the global financial crisis, the world economy entered a new normal, and there are mounting challenges that need to be managed. The global governance system has not been able to keep pace with the scale and complexity of these challenges. So we feel an equitable and global economic order is better for trade, investment, and other forms of commercial activity to take place according to agreed upon rules, and that those rules should reflect the principles of the developing countries as well. We really need a new narrative for the role and importance of this rules-based international economy, one that inspires hope and fear in equal measure. So we have committed to continue to do whatever it takes to support the global economy and financial stability using fiscal, monetary, and regulatory levers in a complementary way for as long as required and consistent with governments and central banks' respective mandates. We acknowledge that the macroeconomic response should be appropriate for country-specific requirements and that fiscal support should not be withdrawn too quickly. We recognize that as the crisis evolves, policy measures will need to adapt to support individuals, businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, and the sectors of our economy that are most severely affected by the health-related measures that are introduced, or which remain, while allowing for structural reallocation to occur wherever necessary. And we will continue to address the disproportionate economic and social impact of the crisis on women, young people, and the most vulnerable sections of society. We commit to take steps to support an inclusive recovery and minimize the scarring impact of the pandemic on medium-term economic growth by adopting relevant tools based on country circumstances. So we acknowledge that measures are needed on both the supply and demand sides to reduce uncertainty and support a strong and sustainable global economy. So I'd end by saying that India, as the engine of global growth and soon of innovation, we hope, is prepared to be a leader. It will lead the search for employment and growth solutions and the fight against climate change, and in creating an architecture for effective global governance and an equitable global economic order in the 21st century. Thank you.
Now, the second speaker that we have is Dr. Rathin Roy. Rathin, it so happens, coincidentally, he's also a graduate of the St. Stephen's College, of which Rahul Chhabra is from. And then Rathin has done his master's in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Later on, he has got his PhD from the university in London, from Cambridge. And thereafter, he has taught in Manchester as well as London universities. He has worked in the United Nations Development Program as a policy advisor, and he has been located in New York, in London, and in Kathmandu, and in Brasilia. That's a long stretch. And then he is also, in the last 7 years, he has been a member of the Advisory Council, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, and also head of the Institute for the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in India, which is a body which advises the government of India. So, and currently he is the managing director of the Overseas Development Institute in London, in UK. So this is our speaker from UK, from Europe, and he has a distinguished career to address the subject. And Rathin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ghanashyam. Let me start by thanking you and the very august audience and my fellow panelists for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I want to start actually by very strongly endorsing what Mr. Chhabra said regarding the importance of reforming global institutions. But I want to make 2 points, which is that while this is necessary, it is not going to be sufficient anymore. And the second is that the entire global institutional arrangement, which is sort of Westphalia grounded, based in the assumption that nation states speak for their people, I think is under challenge today, and with good reason. One of the consequences of this is that the alternative stage, which is profoundly not Westphalian, which is the world of international finance, now, at least since globalization accelerated, has had a greater and greater weight on how the course of international economic relations and international economics develops. To make my point, please recall that there is nothing even remotely approximating the IMF or even WTO in the world of international finance. There is only Basel, and Basel is fundamentally a minor regulatory entity, which is all we have in terms of a permanent institution for financial regulation. I'll go into that in a minute, but let me come to our theme, inequality. I think both Ambassador Ghanashyam and Secretary Chhabra gave you a very eloquent snapshot of what is happening. The interesting feature of this in the past 20 years or 30 years of globalization has been that while between country inequality has been falling, within country inequality has been rising, and the inequality between the top 5% in the richest 5 countries in the world and the top 5% in the emerging economies has fallen. So the elites have come together, but within country inequality has risen in large part as a consequence of the fact that emerging economies' aggregate incomes have grown closer to that of developed economies. And so you get situations where the main driver of inequality, which is essentially assets and their heredity. I commend you to Thomas Piketty's book. I don't agree with all of it, but this important point he makes. The fundamental enemy of equity is heredity. And that is not a rule we question anywhere in the world, except perhaps in North Korea, or perhaps not even there. In fact, probably not even there. The right of a businessman to, provide their shares to their progeny, the right of an individual to bequeath their estate to their progeny, means that as countries and societies grow rich, the richer people in these countries and societies accumulate assets faster. In the course of 1 or 2 or 3 generations, they bequeath these assets to their children, while the people who are not getting rich are not able to do so, At best, they're only able to start earning better incomes, so that asset inequality creates income inequality. So what you get are asset rich and therefore income rich elites and asset poor and steadily increasing income rich non-elites. And I think the source of a lot of the tension that we are seeing today in countries against fundamentally globalization, what Ambassador Ghanashyam referred to as a march towards sort of more, I wouldn't call it national, because I don't understand nationalism. I'm a patriot, but not a nationalist. But a more inward looking sort of societal inquiry as to the causes of dissatisfaction of many who felt that their legitimate aspirations as a consequence of globalization were not taking them far enough. These are not the poor. In fact, poverty has declined, that may reverse now, quite spectacularly in large parts of the world that used to be poor, and in fact has increased, regrettably, in countries like where I am now, the UK, much of Europe, and large swathes of the United States. So it's not the poor I'm talking about. It's the people earning the minimum wage to 4 times the minimum wage in different countries who have some income to be able to reflect, to protest, and to make choices. These people, I think, are experiencing a profound discontent that is rooted in what they have not yet recognized, because they keep electing leaders who are part of the asset inequality problem, like Donald Trump. But what they perceive is that there is a global elite which talks to each other, which trades with each other, which works with each other, principally for their own enrichment. And this global elite has fixed the rules of the game of globalization such that those who are aspirational and see reasonable rises in income are kept out of a transformational aspiration, because that is not accompanied by equal access to assets. And this has the unfortunate result, as it often does, that more primordial inequalities, like those of gender, ethnicity, religion, caste, become political issues of great debate, not just in my own country, India, but also in the country where I'm resident. Brexit was not about the economics of Brexit. Brexit is all about this perception that pan-European elite politics, in my view, is something that works to the detriment of the average Briton, and the average Briton, the average earning Briton. And hence, it is unacceptable, and just getting rid of it would cause a different pathway to be chosen, principally by disempowering the globalized elites who manufactured this. Now, that means that if that is your concern, then other progressive causes, such as gender inequality, or global causes, one that's very dear to my heart, which is the fundamental inequality and disempowerment that children face across the world because society is stacked in the way it is, these take a backseat. At the root of this inequality is global finance. And let me go back for a minute to Westphalia to give you an illustration of this. The total volume of aggregate savings generated per year in the world, Ghanashyam mentioned an $80 trillion income pot. Roughly about 6% of that is saved at least, right? So that's about $5 trillion a year. That is more than enough for investments in the SDGs and climate change and everything else. But it is not forthcoming for these things because the income, the bulk of these savings, not in flow, but in stock, are held in the richest geographies of the world, and there are 3 of them: the United States, the European Union, and Japan. I include Britain for a minute in the European Union. I still can till the end of this month. Now, the people holding these assets are largely part of the demographic profile of these countries, which is biased to the 55 pluses. If I may use the phrase non-pejoratively, old, rich, asset-rich people in asset-rich geographies command savings, which could potentially be used to alleviate all the things we want to do in the Sustainable Development Goals, except that to do those things, you would have to invest outside those geographies in substantial measure. And the willingness and ability to invest in these outside geographies in areas that are not, in a sense, firewalled or foolproofed by the elites is limited. So your typical asset investor is willing to invest in a food delivery platform or in a cinema complex or a shopping mall or even an airline, but not in water systems, not in agriculture, and only now with great reluctance in renewable energy. I think this dimension of the inequality problem and the action needed on this, for this is a global problem in my view, and is worthy of multilateral action, is simply not on the stage, whether at the IMF meetings annually, or at convenings in Wall Street, or in the City of London, or for that matter, very regrettably, in the capitals of the emerging economies. There is a large, resounding silence about the unequalizing force of global finance and our ability to intervene collectively to address it. And here I would say that I stopped working with the G20 in 2016 because I realized that there was neither, and in fact, for that matter, the UN development system, because there was neither the willingness nor the confidence nor the ability to take this on. And in the absence of political leadership that is willing to take it on, which I don't see and I've not seen for a while, I've seen glimmers of it during the Obama administration, only glimmers. I feel that we are entirely bypassing the major global economic inequality challenge of the day, which has to do with where assets are and why they're not being deployed. The market will not help us here because you see, by the market logic, if you make about 12% in India investing in renewables, and let's say my exchange rate depreciates by 10% a year, I'm being very generous, and there's nothing wrong with I'm not going to get into a good or bad. That's a bucket of nonsense. The exchange rate depreciates on the basis of supply and demand. There's nothing good or bad about a depreciating or appreciating exchange rate, as long as the depreciation or appreciation is intelligent and predictable. So let's assume that India's exchange rate should depreciate because absent COVID, we run a balance of payments deficit. And that means obviously our demand for foreign currency is greater than the demand for domestic currency because we buy more from foreigners than we sell them. So the price of the rupee will fall relative to other currencies. How much should it fall by? I don't think it ought to fall by as much as 10%, but on a bad day it might. So if you do the math, you're going to get about 4.5% to 5% return in India, even if you invest in rupees and forget the hedging. Why would you not do it? There lies the problem. The problem there lies that there is something called political, regulatory, and institutional risk, which is a real phenomenon, but is fundamentally a normative phenomenon. And institutions like the World Bank and the ADB and other multilateral institutions, and regrettably the BRICS Bank too, which is actually, I think, a pale copy in some ways of these other institutions. I'd be happy to be corrected, but I don't see any evidence that it is procedurally working any differently from anyone else. In fact, the few people who do work procedurally differently are export-import banks like the Indian Exim Bank and others. But absent that, your entire business of credit risk rating and your entire business of appraisal of a sovereign situation is foundationally normative and therefore is not amenable to market logic or quantitative metrics such as the pricing argument I gave you. the normative nature is masked by some things that are done by these agencies. I'll give you an example, and I think it's a mask. 40% of your typical sovereign credit rating depends on your per capita GDP. Now, you know perfectly well that that needle takes a long time to move, but you persist with it because you want to assert the stylized fact that a country that is poor relative to others, even if it is getting richer very fast, is not a country you're going to invest in until it becomes rich. And that is what that high weight to per capita GDP tells me. So the fact that the credit rating agencies and others use quantitative or empirical measures doesn't alter the fact that the basis for their judgment is highly normative. So in the space of nation states, when I said the debate has bypassed Westphalia, has bypassed New York, has bypassed Basel, and has led to an entire poverty of institutional action on these matters, in the case of the nation state, there is a huge initiative to intervene in this and to challenge the alphabetical ranking of safe and non-safe spaces that is generated essentially by the desire of those in asset-rich countries to buck market trends and continue to invest there so that the kind of asset equalization you would see if you followed market trends would not happen. Because that keeps profits and assets in the current geographies in the face of the changing nature of income growth and distribution, which is shifting much more towards the Indo-Pacific, and hopefully will shift to Africa very soon as well, away from, if you like, American and European geographies. The one country, of course, that has bucked this trend is China, in my view, and has bucked it well, and we have a lot to learn from China in this respect. But I do not think that China is going to buck this trend there are no incentives. I'm not saying anything. I'm not making an ad hominem comment on China. I know it's very popular in India and elsewhere. It's boring. I'm saying that at the moment there is no incentive for China to buck this trend when its weight in global affairs, in global economic affairs, which is not very far away, becomes large enough for it to benefit from this trend. And that is what I think the Chinese will do, precisely because there's no multilateral action to provide them with an incentive not to do it. And dare I say, if India had been China, they'd have probably done the same. So I'm not making a normative comment at all. I'm just saying that is how you will respond. Now, so much for, I think, what the major problem in Westphalian approaches to the global inequality problem is. And it's intimately tied to the globalization of elites and those equations that I mentioned at the outset, obviously. Because, it's my final point on this, this trend does not necessarily detract from the prosperity of elites in other geographies, which is why Indians and Russians are the largest investors in London real estate, which is why outward investment from India is so significant in these northern geographies. Because once you're part of this globalized elite, then your incentives to perpetuate this are actually aligned with the northern elites in globalized countries, and that is a genuine problem with globalization and the consequent reduction of inequality in all its dimensions between elites in different geographies. Now, my final point on globalization comes to the within-country inequality question. And I want to pose this to you using climate change as an example. You see, in the 80s, when I was a student, the debate on the environment was a debate about the inequality of consumption. The argument there was that if we are to preserve the environment, we need to reduce global consumption. The trouble was that even after 40 years of global prosperity, a large number of people in the globe did not have enough to consume even the basic necessities of life, let alone aspirational necessities. Therefore, a reduction in global consumption would mean that those who were responsible for the bulk of consumption, that is the rich, in geographies and rich people wherever they lived, would need to alter their pattern of consumption. And the advocacy was consume less. Think small is beautiful, think the Brundtland report, and think of the importance of the word commons. Now, I put it to you that what climate change has done is effectively completely destroyed that consumption-related teleological view of how to solve the environmental problem. Because what climate change is telling you essentially is that to reduce global carbon footprints is the chief environmental problem. But to do that, we don't have to reduce consumption. Obviously, if global consumption went down, you would reduce the global carbon footprint, and that then you would start saying whose consumption. But the way you bypass that question now is saying nobody needs to reduce their consumption because carbon footprint is all about energy, and therefore what we are going to do is give you market-driven technologies called renewables, which will reduce your global consumption, which will enable you to consume what you were consuming earlier, with a different technology that is market friendly. So everyone continues to make money, everyone consumes the same, everyone meaning the same distribution. A person in Sweden whose Arctic is melting can continue to sit in their shirt sleeves, as I'm doing in this room, because there's central heating, except now the central heating is powered by renewables. I don't need to worry about it. Why is this bad? This is bad because it does many things that are fundamentally unequalizing. It does not, so a climate warrior does not care in the core of their argument whether a unit of energy from whatever source is used to light a light bulb in a school in India or Bangladesh or to do central heating. It doesn't matter because the carbon footprint is lowered because of renewables. You have a free pass, right? So the entire debate on whose consumption and how it should be something that India and other countries have argued very forcefully, but I think they've missed this key analytical point by talking about, when they were sort of forced into a corner on common but differentiated responsibility. I'm also guilty. I should have thought of this. I've just worked this out now. I should have thought of this before Paris. But it's come to my notice now when people start talking about climate inaction purely in terms of energy. And why is this important? Because what if I had persisted with the debate on the commons? Then action on climate change would have been things that in countries like India would also impact things that matter to our people. The priority would not be energy, which is an intermediate good. The priority would be sustainable food systems. The priority would be how to feed people more equitably at affordable prices without subsidy, without leaching the soil of land, destroying the air through crop burning, and conserving water. That is now thrown out of the window. That's boxed out. How do countries that are transforming their urbanization build urban habitats that respect the commons and thereby reduce climate change? So you see the entire shift, and this is why I am inherently very interrogative of technology. The entire shift of the argument from the 80s and Brundtland to the argument of that, which was essentially about how much we are consuming and what that's doing to our common planetary boundaries, to now, which is about the technologies that we are using to produce energy for consumption that is affecting our planetary boundaries, has resulted in the deprioritization of the concerns of those whose life is being affected by the environment, and the continued prioritization of rich people. I'm not just saying people in developed countries, of people who live in rich people, and of course rich geographies. So to conclude, therefore, I think if you look at both finance and climate change, you will see two things I'm trying to illustrate. One, that the debate is no longer about Westphalia. It involves Westphalia because geographies differ, and therefore I've given you several examples. But it moves beyond that because these questions are not the questions that multilateral institutions are debating. In the case of climate, the question has been closed off by the switch from the word environmental sustainability to the focus on climate change, which I regard as a part of environmental sustainability, only a subset. And what I'm trying to say to you is that changing energy technology was not the only way to solve it, but it was chosen and subsidized and made viable because that meant that the rules of the game and the focus would not shift. And the other is the role of finance and the incentives for both rich geographies or geographies that transform and become richer, as well as elites, that is, rich people in poorer countries, to align with a fundamentally unequalizing system of finance that is in fact very carefully structured using normative principles to defy market logic, for I'm an economist. And the market logic of savings in rich countries moving to make money in poor countries is inescapable to me. And therefore, I will call it out as something that is happening not because of the market, but in defiance of the market. And I would say that these are the two major economic inequality challenges of the day globally. Of course, they're both political economy challenges, and they must be addressed as such. But I think if you do a root cause analysis, as I've tried to do very briefly today, you will see that our attention is not where it ought to be. Thank you.
The third speaker, I think, is, as I was telling before the session began, that I typed his name in the Google search engine, and in 0.46 seconds, it hit 1.25 billion sites. That is about Kishore Mahbubani. And then I saw his background. He has studied, he's got a degree in philosophy from Singapore, and then he has gone to Canada and got his master's in philosophy. Again, he has gone from there to Harvard. He spent some time in Harvard also. And the most fascinating thing that I found about him is every book that he has written has a message, which is very rare. And there are a lot of people write many books, and he has written about 9 of them. And I've read only 3 of them. I must apologize. I have not read the other 6. But I thought honesty is the best policy. And I would like to read some of the other books, because some of them will become relevant now, because they say, I remember in the year 2009, I think, it was the Financial Times of London, which said that they listed 50 personalities who will shape the debate on the future of capitalism. And Professor Mahbubani was sitting in it. So I'm talking about 2009, that is more than a decade ago. Then the Foreign Policy Association of New York, they have an interesting statement about him, which after this, I don't have to give any more introduction to Professor Mahbubani. It says, Professor Mahbubani is a gifted diplomat, a student of history and philosophy, a provocative writer, and an intuitive thinker. I think that's so. I hope I have not raised the expectations of Professor Mahbubani's expose, which is going to come up. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor Mahbubani, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, Ambassador Ghanashyam, you actually done me a disfavor. You raised the expectations way too high. But I do want to begin by thanking Mr. Moses Manoharan for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel. It's a great pleasure to meet you, Ambassador Ghanashyam, over the virtual screen, and it's of course a great honor and pleasure to be with Ambassador Chhabra and Dr. Rathin on this panel. And my contribution is this. I think the facts we cannot dispute. All the facts are there. But it's like Rashomon, right? You can have the same facts, but different stories. So I'm going to use the same facts that everybody has used, but tell a different story. And the story basically has 3 points. The first point is what really genuinely accomplished. The subject is towards an equitable international order. What exactly have we accomplished in the past 30 years? And then the second question is related to that is, how is the West reacting to what we have accomplished in the last 30 years? And finally, what will the next 30 years be like in terms of how are we going to progress? And the first point I'm going to make about what have we accomplished in the past 30 years, I think it's very important for us to recognize, and this is what I mean about Rashomon, okay? That the past 30 years, in terms of human development, and especially human development through elimination of poverty, have been the best 30 years in 3,000 years of human history. Never before in human history have we uplifted so many people from absolute poverty. And not only that, we also know how we did it. And I go back a long way. I'm very old, by the way. And I remember all the development economists talking about how you're going to get these people out of poverty, you must increase international aid, and so on and so forth. And guess what? International aid virtually had zero impact on poverty reduction. Poverty reduction has been achieved by countries opening up to international trade. And the correlation is absolutely stunning. And I want to give 3 examples, the data from 3 examples, just to illustrate the key point that if you want to reduce poverty, it's very easy. Open up your country to international trade, poverty drops dramatically. The 3 examples are, number 1, of course, and we've all spoken about this, China. In 1992, that's about 28 years ago, China's total trade was 166 billion, and the number of people living below extreme poverty, below $1.90 a day, was 56.7%. More than half of China's population was in extreme poverty. Total trade 166 billion. By 2018, China's total trade had gone up to $4.6 trillion, a nearly 28 times increase in 28 years, and the population living below poverty fell from 56.7 to 0.5%. Future historians will be amazed at this. If you think China is amazing, wait. The next example is even more amazing. This country was literally the Somalia of Asia. It fought wars non-stop from 1939 to 1989. Fought all the great powers. Okay, France, United States, China, right? And after 50 years of poverty, 30 years, it decided to open up. Okay? That country is Vietnam. In 1992, Vietnam's total trade was $5.1 billion, and the percentage living below poverty stood at 52%, right? In 2018, Vietnam's total trade rose to $527 billion, 100 times increase. And during this period, its population living below poverty declined 26 times to 1.9%, right? Isn't that amazing? And if you talk to the former director of the World Bank, Kim, he says that the greatest poverty reduction story in the world is Vietnam's poverty reduction story. Now I'll bring my 3rd example. And it's a country that you all know better than I do, even though I know it, because my mother was an Indian nationalist. It's India. And here in India, the correlation is very striking. Because India, as we all know, opened up around 91, 92 with Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And look at the track record. Between 1977 and 1993, a 25-year period, India's poverty went down from 63% to 47.6% over 25 years. But then India opened up. And guess what? After India opened up to international trade, its total trade went from $45 billion in 1992 to $940 billion in 2018, a 20 times increase. And poverty went down from 47.6% to less than 7%. You can see that there's a direct correlation between countries opening up to trade and poverty going down. So clearly, if you want to figure out how you want to create a better world order, if you want to get rid of extreme poverty, it's very simple. Persuade countries to open up the international trade. Now, this brings me to point 2. the people who should be celebrating this should be the Western countries. Why the Western countries? Because they were the ones preaching the virtues of foreign trade, opening up the international trade in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And I'm so glad that Ambassador Chhabra mentioned the new International Economic Order, NIEO. I know it very well. I was ambassador to the UN from 84 to 89, and I was sitting in the front benches. Singapore was a member of the G77. The West was on the other side, North-South debate, and the Northern ambassadors with great condescension saying, hey, listen, you guys, don't ask for aid. Open up to trade, and you'll be fine. And you know, by the way, the German ambassador actually was quite condescending. He said, listen, if you really want to prosper and develop, you got to be able to deliver 12 towels of the certain quality in a certain packet to my country, and then that will lift your country up. Which is correct in some ways. Deliver towels of a certain quality, certain quantity, and you'll succeed. And guess what? Most of the countries who listen to the West and opened up have succeeded. And therefore, there should be a convergence now between the West and the East Asian countries, right? You know what? There's a divergence. Why? And this, of course, is the big story. You mentioned Ambassador Ghanashyam. I've written the book. Actually, I discussed it in two of my recent books, Has the West Lost It? And the book I have behind me, Has China Won? Because there was an unfortunate coincidence. Remember, I keep saying past 30 years, past 30 years, past 30 years, right? The greatest improvement in the human condition, past 30 years, past 30 years. You know what happened 30 years ago? There was an unfortunate coincidence of two major historical moments. The first was the end of history moment, right? Francis Fukuyama said, the Cold War has ended, the West has won, we have now achieved the peak of human evolution. We all have liberal democratic societies. And as I say in a somewhat cruel fashion, Francis Fukuyama did a lot of brain damage to the West because he put the West to sleep 30 years ago at precisely the moment when China, India, and the rest of Asia were waking up. And why is that significant? Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were always those of China and India. They just happened to have gone to sleep for 200 years, but they woke up. And the moment when they decided to wake up, which was what I call the return of history moment, coincided with the end of history moment. The West went to sleep when Asia woke up, and you can see the gap today. And I bet you, if I became ambassador to the UN today, the German ambassador would not speak condescendingly about international trade to Asians. He would not. He would actually say, maybe I have some things to learn from you guys. Because right now, paradoxically, even though the Western prescription of greater international trade has worked, has delivered the greatest upliftment of human condition, the West has lost confidence. Seriously. And you know, in the case of the United States, especially the leading Western country, we have got so used to United States being a shining city on the hill, a country that will lead the world. The United States today is in deep trouble. And in fact, Dr. Rathin Roy, I think, referred to it, some of the points. But I say the deep trouble is because the United States has gone from being a democracy where you have government of the 100% by the 1%, of the government of the people, by the people, for the people, towards becoming a plutocracy where you have a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. Now, I think Dr. Rathin Roy has given lots of data, but what is really shocking, this is what nobody wants to touch on this. It's one thing for the 1% to steal all the wealth of the country. Okay, they did it legitimately. Maybe it's not stealing. They got it. But they have used their 1% of their wealth not just to take over economic influence, they have taken control of the political system also. And, the man who warned the Americans against this was America's greatest philosopher of recent times, John Rawls, in his book, Theory of Justice. And he said, once you allow money to control the political process, then money will shift the political decisions to suit them. And I can give you example after example after example. So it doesn't matter whether or not there's Trump or Biden, America has a structural problem. So all this brings me to my third and most important point. We can no longer rely on the United States or even Western Europe to deliver growth to the global economy. These are societies, for different reasons, having serious internal issues. And if you look at the latest issue of The Economist, which has it's entitled The World in 2021, and my essay there makes the case that what COVID-19 has demonstrated is that there has been a shift of competence from the West to the East. That's shown in the number of deaths per million population. In East Asia is less than 10. And in Europe it's hundreds, thousands, in US hundreds, and so on and so forth. So then the result of that, that's why when you look at the next 30 years, if you want to figure out where the growth is going to come from, there is no doubt that the growth is going to come from East Asia. And it's been confirmed by two major developments, and I'll mention them. I'll stop there and answer the questions that are coming. The first major development is the signing of the world's largest free trade agreement. Remember, I begin my point one. Growth is a result of trade. Guess what? The world's largest free trade agreement is not going to be signed in the Americas, not going to be signed by Europe. It's being signed in East Asia by 15 countries, the 10 ASEAN countries, plus China, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, New Zealand. Of course, the door is open for India to join also, and everybody will be thrilled and delighted if India joined the RCEP. But here's the most important point about RCEP that nobody knows. The Western media says the RCEP is driven by China. Absolute bullshit. If China drove the RCEP, it wouldn't have happened. RCEP happened because ASEAN drove it. It only happened because ASEAN has signed free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And why is that fact important? Because if the three largest economies in East Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, if they sat in a room and tried to negotiate a free trade agreement, they would fail. The distrust between China, Japan, and South Korea is phenomenal. Guess what? Under the ASEAN umbrella, they came in and we helped them negotiate a free trade agreement, and that's where the growth is going to come now. So let me conclude with one statistic, final statistic, of the leading indicator of growth in the world. As we know, you can only trade when you have markets, right? You've got to sell goods, you have markets. The world's largest market was always, for the last 130 years, was United States, by far. Now let me give you one last statistic. In the year 2009, the size of the retail goods market in China, to which the German ambassador was sent towels to, was $1.8 trillion. And United States was $4 trillion, double that of China, only 10 years ago, 2009. Fast forward 2019, the size of the retail goods market in China went up 3 times to $6 trillion. And the size of the retail goods market in the United States just went up to $5.5 trillion, right? And 10 years from now, the retail goods market in China combined with East Asia is going to be by far the biggest markets in the world. That's where trade will flow, and that's where the growth is going to come from. And therefore, when we speak 10 years from now, I hope we will say that thanks to this growth in trade, we have a totally eliminated global poverty to down to 0. And I think we can do it in the next 10 years. Thank you.
I'm conflicted as a former Singaporean and now an Indian national. I put it to you, Ambassador Mahbubani. I wonder if people have forgotten. There were one of your old colleagues an age ago, an eon ago, spoke, Chan Heng-chi, spoke about why not, I think she was meaning not just Asia, but more specifically ASEAN countries, take the investment, the aid, the benefits, economic benefits from China and have that relationship and have the umbrella of security provided by the US. And the Chinese were very upset at the time, and they responded that, hey, you want us to be to finance opposition to us. So in this is the continuity like Indonesia, who is in the borderline between this and that. How do you go about this? Can you respond, sir?
Should I? Yes.
Yeah, please.
Well, I mean, my good friend Ambassador Chan would be very happy to be mentioned in this regard, and I do. I'm glad you make that point, because we would certainly like in East Asia to see a strong United States rather than a weak United States. So when I talk about America becoming a plutocracy, it's not with a sense of joy or celebration. It's a great deal of sadness, because the one key reason why this region, especially ASEAN, has done so well is because of the strong American role in this region. I'll give you another statistic. Okay, the United States has invested more in the 10 ASEAN countries, which are supposedly the poor 10 ASEAN countries, than it has invested in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. You look at that. China, Japan, Korea, South India are much bigger economies. ASEAN is so much smaller, and ASEAN's got more American investment. So there are huge reservoirs of goodwill here inside Southeast Asia for the United States. But the trouble is that the United States doesn't understand that the game here is a long game. This is now a new 100-year, 1,000-year game. It's a different game, and to play in the game, you got to turn up. And the fundamental problem the United States has had in attending the ASEAN meetings is that every year the American president is supposed to come for East Asian Summit. They won't turn up. And this year, last month, Donald Trump couldn't even appear for the meeting virtually. He didn't have to fly to Southeast Asia. He didn't appear. And similarly for the ASEAN ministerial meetings, all our Asian partners come. The Indian foreign minister comes. The American Secretary of State will find a new crisis and not turn up. So yes, we want to see a strong United States role in this region, and would very much welcome it. But it has to be a very careful, thoughtful, intelligent presence in this region. And the United States must learn to play the long game. And just to tell you why that is important, in my book, Has China Won? I begin by describing a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger. And at that one-on-one lunch with Henry Kissinger, you know what he said to me? He said the fundamental mistake the United States has made in taking on China is that the United States doesn't have any kind of long-term strategy to deal with China. And if you don't have a long-term strategy to deal with China, then unfortunately, you might lose the game.
Thank you.